All right, this is Andy McNeill and Misty Hale here with Free Arkansas, and we're going to do a new segment called What Do We Notice Here in the River Valley, broadly with politics this week. And so, Misty, what did you notice?
Well, I think everybody's talking about the fat generals. That was fun.
How did it make you feel, or tell us about it?
Well, okay. I loved it. I think that the recommendations for the PT standards are much needed. You know, we've all seen the clips of the angry generals in the room, just like stone cold, dead face, like no applause, nothing. That makes sense to me because they are in power in a system that is being threatened by these particular changes. So nobody's like, yeah, I'm at the top of the food chain. Please come in and undermine that food chain, right? So of course they're not going to like it. But I think overall, it's not aimed at the generals. It's aimed at the rank and file. And I think it only lends itself to a stronger military.
Got it.
But what did you think, Andy?
Well, I thought it was all a bit bizarre. I think that if you're going to take people that work for you and you're going to set standards or policies, you know, you didn't need all the pomp and circumstance. So to take 800 people from around the world and fly them in and then stand in front of them and sort of lecture them, you know, I found it unnecessary. And it you know, what I ended up worrying about is, you know, we talk about fat generals. You know, I just point out that some of our really good generals like Norman Schwarzkopf and Patton were all heavy. And I've heard it said that, you know, perhaps we should worry about the fat between their ears more than the fat on their bodies when we're talking about generals and the decisions they make. You know, so I sort of looked at it as maybe bad politics to do that. But what I do think is that, you know, I do think that we can have, you know, higher standards. And I suppose that people that have one particular news feed will get pictures of military folks that are not in shape, or let's just say sort of looking more, you know, less menacing, maybe. I don't know what the right word to say, you know. And so anyway, that's what I ended up, you know, that's how I thought about it at the end of the day.
So let me ask you a question. Is your dislike of it more about the aesthetics of how it was announced, or more about the nuts and bolts of the policy changes?
I think it's more about the pomp and circumstance. I think that if you were to say, hey, listen, we're going to change certain policies and we're going to enforce certain rigor, I think you can do that in a way where you're not really embarrassing people. So one of the things I worry about is, you know, everybody in the world sees this, and we're the largest military. So you bring everybody down, you have someone sort of talk down to these generals, which, by the way, a lot of these people are the ones that stuck it out in the military, right? They're the ones that love the military. And a lot of them could just leave and get probably much better paying jobs. And you're getting lectured by somebody who never rose to these ranks. And so it seems like that's unnecessary fodder that can backfire if what you really want to do is lead people to change. You know, and so if what you're trying to do is make a political statement, perhaps it works. So, you know, I guess it just depends on what you want.
See, I don't mind the aesthetics. That's the way Trump gets things done, right? That's his whole thing, is the pomp and the circumstance. And I mean, if you look at the numbers, the Army recruiting is like at a 15-year high, and Navy recruiting is like at a 30-year high since Hegseth has come on board. So I think people who are military minded that are coming out of school, they gravitate toward the type of leadership that Hegseth presents.
Okay.
Else you wouldn't see these numbers going up the way you do.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting perspective for sure. I mean, I think that the risk for Hegseth is you try to do it like Trump. And Trump he's like a unicorn. He can do things that when you try to emulate him, he comes off okay regardless of what he does, but other people just don't. You know,
That's a good point.
You know,
it's very unique.
Here's what I noticed this week. What I think it was sort of interesting, and just sort of the continued assault on America academia, is they sent out letters this week to 9 universities. And so they include both private universities Vanderbilt, MIT, but also public universities, Arizona, Virginia, Texas. And essentially it's a compact that they want people to sign. And here are some of the highlights. And and a lot of it is centered around politics. But here's sort of the list: bars employees from expressing their political views on behalf of their employers, bans race and gender hiring and admissions, freezes the tuition for the next 5 years, caps the international enrollment at 15%, requires an ACT or SAT type of test, quell grade inflation. And there's a whole number of other things that are in here. The carrot that dangles out in front of you is more federal funding or easing up on the federal funding. Of course, the stick is if you don't sign it, you might not get the funding. Mm-hmm. And there's all this self-policing. And so here's what I think about this. So I started wondering, why does this make sense, and who's really behind this? And I think there's a number of groups that, for various reasons, want to attack American universities. And while I can't argue for the idea about a vibrant marketplace of ideas, because I think that's super important, I think these attacks are a bit unnecessary, and I think they also will have unintended consequences. So, I think that there are people out there that have this perspective that unqualified people are getting into these universities. And generally there's a race element to that. What I think is if you make these things strictly on ACT and SAT, it's really going to hurt small town America. Because if we make it strictly on what the student's performance is at that moment, and we erase the concept of potentiality. Just think about if we said our football team is only going to pick people that are really good right this second, and nobody with the potential to go forward that isn't quite there just yet. I think what you're going to get, which is already what happens at these places, is you're just going to have a further proliferation of prep school folks that get to go to these universities. Because you won't be able to compete with folks that are pouring money at a higher rate into their kids. And the last thing I think is, who decides what a vibrant marketplace looks like? They talk in here about having auditors, to do it. And I look at it and say,
right now, academia decides, which is part of the problem.
Well, I still think just having been on campuses, I sit there and go where is all these problems? Is it the accounting department? Is it the math department? Is it the ag department? Where can you point to it? And then the other thing I think, and I'm being a bit long-winded on this, but I look at this and it's interesting. Polls overwhelmingly show Americans support the funding that they get. And that's because so much of the funding has nothing to do with undergraduate students. Most all the funding is PhD level people doing work on cancer and Alzheimer and a array of stuff. And, a lot of them happen to be the smartest people, in those fields. And so, it's a shame that if we, in order to push one agenda, we kick cancer back a little ways. And even if it's a small ways, it's a tragedy, in my opinion. What do you think?
Well, okay. So it's very nuanced, of course. There's a lot of different ways to come at this. What you said about, you're talking about economic diversity, where you think it might hurt small towns. And that doesn't have anything to do with racial diversity. But I do see a role for ensuring that universities have economic diversity coming into their doors. That's really important. But I don't think that has anything to do with race. And actually, there's a 2023 Pew poll that showed that 74% of Americans are against race-based admissions at universities, and that included 59% of Democrats. So it is a popular thing to get away from race-based admissions. In the free marketplace of ideas, there was another poll that showed that 62% of students feel like they have to self-censor in the classroom. And we had Dr. Oh my gosh, his name escapes me. We had that great
Moranto.
Yes, Dr. Moranto on to talk about how students and, academics have to self-censor to feel comfortable in the academic setting if they're conservative. and it was two times as many conservative students reported self-censorship in the academic setting as opposed to more leftist students. And that's a big problem. And to me, this kind of goes back to the same thing of the fat generals. We have a system where the people who are in charge got to be in charge through that system. So they perpetuate their same ideas over and over and over. They bring up people who think like them. They teach them to think like them. Then when they do think like them, they put them in charge to do the same thing over and over. And it's just, it's so homogenous and incestuous in its thinking. And I think you got to break that. I don't know if I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, but I'm saying there is a problem. And I think our universities serve administrations and serve ideologies. They do not serve students. So
sure,
that's my soapbox, Andy.
Well, I would say, this. I think you should be able to express whatever ideas you want to, regardless of the spectrum, all the way to the left and all the way to the right. And one of the things I find confusing for me, and maybe this is just because I don't, even though I'm on a campus, is that, I often don't think we're talking about what's said in the classroom, although it could be true, but just like, you picture the list of classes that I listed and say, like, where is liberal or conservatism in accounting, right? Like if you're talking about what I really think happens, and maybe what they're talking about is the larger voices that are kind of on the campus itself. But I'm not positive. This is where I don't know where it comes from.
Oh, I guarantee I see on my social media feeds of students, conservative students in colleges getting shouted down just in their world history classes for having a different viewpoint of I don't think America is terrible. I don't think that there's something wrong with me because I'm a white person. Those viewpoints get shouted down in those classes, often with very little support from the teaching staff.
Yeah, I actually think that diversity is really important. And if I were, if I were setting up a school and I was doing it the way that I'd want to do it, I'd want a diversity of opinions, a diversity of culture, a diversity of location, a diversity of economic status. And I still would want a certain academic standard, but that would be a range. I wouldn't say it all has to be up here. And the reason I would do that is I think it would produce the most vibrant campus.
We fully agree on that. 100%.
What I worry about this though, in some sense, is the more that you force one particular view for whatever the reasons are, later on, someone can change that and force some different view. And so, I think that some of this, they got to be really, really careful, or it's a slippery slope.
Well, see, I think what they're doing is stopping the forcing of views and enabling a greater diversity of views. Because I think we really only do have one viewpoint on college campuses right now. And all this is doing is trying to say, let's have more than one viewpoint.
Okay, let's switch gears. What else have you noticed this week?
Okay, well, so I love X. I've always followed Sarah Huckabee Sanders. And, one of the things that really, it hurts my soul is how much they bully her on X. And not about her viewpoints. You want to have a separate viewpoint from somebody, go for it all day long. But I hate it when people bully women in particular, because I'm a woman and I know how we can feel about this. I hate it when we bully people on their physical appearance and on things like that, they don't have anything to do with their beliefs or her political agenda. So I noticed this week, she put out a couple of posts, and the comments about her physical appearance, her fashion choices were absolutely just, if she was a teenage girl, I would worry for her mental well-being. Now, I think Sarah Huckabee Sanders probably has very thick skin growing up in the family she did and having the profession she does. But I just can't stand to see it. And I wish people would stop because it is not the right way to go about anything.
Yeah, I really can't disagree with that. I actually think that the anonymity, even though someone's got some tagline, brings out the worst in people, and I think that people end up saying really awful things. And so there's a spectrum of awfulness, for sure, and I think that, I think when it's, tilts toward violence, that's an awful zip code. And I also think that, basically commenting on people's families, their looks, when it's in response to something that is something that's about a policy or a view, it doesn't serve the greater good for sure, right?
Yeah.
And so I would agree that people can say what they want, but and I think I don't want an environment where I can't say what I want, but I also think it's pretty crappy.
It is. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be able to put that, or that, X should censor that. I don't. I think they should be allowed to write whatever they want. But it's just so mean, and it's so bad for their own spirit and soul.
Yeah. Maybe that will filter out into the ecosystem a little bit here, and just maybe touch a few people here, even locally, for the things that they launch, And so oftentimes I have this thing where I notice that people often launch this stuff in the evening. And sometimes I just want to wonder if I could have a video on them and what were they doing right before they launched? Were they reading something? What is the trigger point? Because my guess is there's some trigger that makes people do it. And then, and I wonder if they have remorse. They look back and go I wonder why I said that, So we'll leave it there. And look forward to talking to you next week.
All right. Thanks.